All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're taking a deep dive into something that might sound like ancient history, but trust me, it's got some surprisingly relevant twists to it. Bills of attainder.
Bills of attainder.
Yeah, like, imagine a law that basically just says, you're guilty, no need for a trial.
Oh, yikes.
Exactly. And not only are you guilty, but we're taking away your rights and your property just because you're part of a certain group.
That sounds pretty terrifying, like something out of a dystopian novel.
It really does. And that's precisely what we're going to unpack in this deep dive.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, you've brought a ton of fascinating sources to the table. Legal documents, historical accounts, even arguments from common law courts. And we're going to sort through all of it. By the end, you'll be a Bill of Attainder expert.
It sounds like a plan. But first, maybe we should start with a clear definition. What exactly is a Bill of Attainder?
I'm glad you
I
asked.
figured you would be.
Well, I think the best way to understand it is to think of it as a law that completely bypasses the whole trial process. It just declares someone or a group of people guilty of a crime. And boom, punishment's handed down.
So, no due process, no chance to defend yourself. That's a pretty far cry from the justice system we're supposed to have.
Absolutely. And not surprisingly, this kind of law has a long and rather dark history, particularly in England and early America.
Right. I can see how this would be ripe for abuse.
Oh, it definitely was. Kings and powerful factions would use these bills of attainder to target their enemies, get rid of rivals, silence dissent.
So basically anyone they didn't like.
Pretty much. They could just declare someone a traitor, seize all their property, and there wasn't really anything anyone could do about it. Our sources mention a pretty striking example with Jack Cade, who led an uprising back in 1450. After his rebellion was crushed, Parliament passed a bill of attainder against him, effectively erasing him from history. His family couldn't inherit anything. It was like he never existed.
Wow, that's chilling. It seems like the Founding Fathers were well aware of how dangerous this kind of power could be.
Oh, absolutely. Having seen firsthand how these legislative trials could be abused, they made sure to shut that door firmly. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution specifically forbids both Congress and state legislatures from passing bills of attainder.
So they basically said, nope, not in our new nation. We're building a system based on fairness and due process, and this kind of arbitrary punishment has no place here.
Exactly. But here's where things get a little tricky.
Uh-oh. What's the catch?
Well, defining what exactly constitutes a bill of attainder in our modern times, well, it's not always so simple.
I bet. Laws and legal interpretations get pretty complex.
They do. The Supreme Court has actually wrestled with this issue quite a bit, trying to pinpoint where that line is, between a legitimate law and an unconstitutional bill of attainder.
It sounds like there could be a lot of gray area there, a lot of room for debate.
You're telling me?
So how do they even start to untangle these cases? What factors do they consider?
That's a great question. And that's exactly what we're going to delve into next.
I'm all ears. Let's unravel this legal puzzle.
So we've established that bills of attainder are, thankfully, a thing of the past in America. Well, at least in the most blatant form.
Right, but as we've just started to unpack, figuring out exactly what qualifies as a bill of attainder in our modern legal landscape can be a real challenge.
Yeah, our sources highlight a bunch of examples where things get a little murky. Let's talk about Cummings v. Missouri, a case from right after the Civil War.
Cummings. That's a landmark case when it comes to the Bill of Attainder clause.
Missouri passed a law saying anyone who wanted to be a priest, teacher, or lawyer had to swear an oath they hadn't supported the Confederacy. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Well, on the surface, maybe. But think about the implications. They were essentially trying to punish people for their political beliefs, even if those beliefs weren't illegal at the time.
That doesn't seem very fair or constitutional.
The Supreme Court agreed. They ruled that denying someone their profession without a trial, based solely on their past political affiliations, was a form of punishment. And that made it a Bill of Attainder, plain and simple.
So even if a law doesn't explicitly label itself a Bill of Attainder, if it singles out people or groups for punishment without a trial, it's unconstitutional. That's a pretty powerful precedent.
It is. And they reinforced that principle the very same year in Ex parte Garland, striking down a similar law for lawyers trying to practice in federal court. But as our sources point out, the debate about bills of attainder didn't end there.
It seems like this concept has a way of popping up in the most unexpected places. And it's not always easy to tell whether a law is a legitimate exercise of government power or a bill of attainder in disguise.
You're right, the line can be blurry and the stakes are high. After all, we're talking about people's fundamental rights, their livelihoods, their reputations.
Exactly. It's not just a theoretical legal debate.
Hmm.
So, how did the courts navigate this gray area? How did they determine whether a law crosses that constitutional line?
It's a complex process. They look at the language of the law itself, the historical context, the legislative debates. They're essentially trying to get into the minds of the lawmakers and figure out what their true intent was.
It sounds like legal detective work. Speaking of which, one case that really dives into this whole intent question is Nixon v. Administrator of General Services from 1977.
Ah, the Nixon tapes case. That's a fascinating one.
Can you remind us what happened there?
Well, as you might recall, during Watergate, Congress passed a law to seize and preserve President Nixon's presidential papers and recordings. Nixon, as you can imagine, was not too happy about this. He argued that this was a blatant bill of attainder, specifically designed to punish him.
Seems like a valid argument. I mean, the law was clearly aimed at him, right?
Right, but the Supreme Court saw things differently. They ruled that the primary purpose of the law wasn't to punish Nixon, but to preserve historically important documents for the public good.
So even though the law specifically targeted Nixon, it wasn't considered a bill of attainder because the underlying intent wasn't punitive. That seems like a very fine distinction.
It is, but it highlights a crucial point. Just because a law focuses on a specific person or group doesn't automatically make it a bill of attainder. The key question is whether the aim is to punish them for past actions.
It's about the why, not just the who. But what about situations where a law might not explicitly name names, but still ends up disproportionately impacting certain individuals or groups? Our sources mention a few examples that fall into this category.
That's another area where things get really tricky. We have a great example in our sources with ACORN, a community organizing group. Back in 2009, the House of Representatives passed a resolution that barred them from receiving any federal funding.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal.
It was, and a lower court actually ruled that this funding ban was an unconstitutional bill of attainder. They saw it as a clear attempt to punish ACORN for its activities, which had become pretty controversial.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing it didn't end there.
You're right. The case went to an appeals court, and they actually overturned the lower court's decision. Their focus was on the fact that the ban didn't completely eliminate ACORN's funding.
So it wasn't considered punishment in the legal sense of the word. I'm starting to see how these cases can hinge on the tiniest details.
They really can. It shows just how much nuance and ambiguity there can be in applying the Bill of Attainder clause to complex, modern-day situations.
Our sources also mention a case involving the Elizabeth Morgan Act, which was struck down as a bill of attainder. Unfortunately, they don't give us a lot of details about the specifics of that case.
Yeah, without more information about what that act entailed, it's tough to provide a detailed analysis. But the fact that it was struck down as a bill of attainder suggests that it likely targeted a very specific individual or a small group and imposed penalties without due process. The court probably saw it as a way to circumvent the judicial system and punish someone without a fair trial. It's a reminder that these types of cases can arise in all sorts of contexts and that the courts have to be vigilant in protecting individual rights.
And speaking of different perspectives, our sources also delve into the common law court approach to bills of attainder, which adds a whole other dimension to our discussion.
Right, and those common law court arguments often present a very different way of looking at these issues. They tend to emphasize inherent rights and the potential for government actions to infringe upon those rights, drawing strong parallels to the injustices of historical bills of attainder.
For example, they claim that the Texas tax code is full of bills of pains and penalties, arguing that people are being stripped of their land without due process to satisfy tax liens. It's a pretty bold statement. What's their reasoning there?
Their argument likely hinges on the idea that certain parts of the Texas tax code might disproportionately impact specific individuals or groups. They could be saying that the way these tax laws are enforced, for example, through property seizures, might be happening without adequate legal protections. Essentially, they're suggesting that these actions by the government are reminiscent of the arbitrary punishments meted out through historical bills of attainder.
So even if their interpretations don't always perfectly align with established legal precedent, the common law court perspective raises some important questions.
It does. It reminds us that we need to be vigilant about protecting individual rights, even in areas like taxation that might not seem as dramatic or contentious as, say, criminal law. It's a reminder that the potential for government overreach exists even in the most seemingly mundane areas of our lives.
It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole Bill of Attainder concept. There's so much more to unpack, so many more scenarios to consider.
There really is, and that's what makes this topic so fascinating.
Well, luckily for us, we have a whole other part to this deep dive. Up next, we're going to explore even more real-world examples. And get ready for this, we're even going to discuss how this Bill of Attainder concept might be connected to modern-day slavery. Stay tuned, folks, because it's about to get really interesting. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground: history, court cases, the common law perspective. But I still feel like we've only just dipped our toes into this whole Bill of Attainder ocean.
It's a deep ocean, that's for sure. And as we've seen, the currents can be pretty unpredictable.
Our sources bring up some really thought-provoking examples of how this concept might apply to modern-day situations. What are some of the scenarios that really stand out to you?
Well, one that comes to mind is the idea of targeting specific corporations or industries with laws that could be construed as bills of attainder. Remember that proposed bill to confiscate bonuses paid to AIG executives after the financial crisis?
Oh, yeah. That one sparked a lot of debate.
It did, and for good reason. Critics argued that it was an attempt by Congress to single out a specific company and punish them without due process. They saw it as a classic bill of attainder, just dressed up in modern clothing.
It's fascinating how this concept, rooted in centuries-old struggles against tyranny, can still resonate so strongly in today's world. It's like the more things change, the more they stay the same.
It really speaks to the enduring power of these fundamental legal principles. The idea that the government can't just arbitrarily decide someone is guilty and punish them without a fair trial, that's a cornerstone of any just society.
It's a reminder that we can't take our rights for granted and that we need to be vigilant in defending them.
Absolutely. Our sources also touch on another area where this Bill of Attainder concept gets really interesting: the rise of secret lists and targeted law enforcement practices. They mention a case in Portland, Oregon, where police created a list of people they considered to have committed livability crimes and then sought to prosecute those individuals more harshly.
Wait, a secret list?
Mhm.
That sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller.
It does, doesn't it? But the implications are very real. Critics argued that using such a list to determine who gets harsher punishments was a clear violation of due process. It was like predetermining guilt before a trial even took place, which is exactly what the Bill of Attainder clause is designed to prevent.
It's a chilling reminder that the fight for justice and due process is never truly over. And it's not just about fighting against blatant tyranny. It's about being aware of these subtle ways that our rights can be eroded, sometimes without us even realizing it.
Exactly. It's about understanding the principles at stake and holding those in power accountable. And speaking of holding people accountable, our common law court source makes a really bold connection between bills of attainder and modern-day slavery.
That's right. They argue that individuals are essentially being sold into slavery through various legal maneuvers. That's a pretty heavy accusation.
It is, and it reflects a deep concern about the potential for government actions, particularly in areas like taxation and property seizures, to effectively strip individuals of their fundamental rights and freedoms. They're drawing a parallel between these modern-day actions and the horrific injustices of historical slavery, arguing that the core principle of individual liberty is being violated in both cases.
It seems like they're making a moral argument as much as a legal one. They're saying, even if these actions don't technically meet the legal definition of slavery, they still violate the same basic principles of human dignity and autonomy.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And it underscores the point that legal debates aren't just about abstract principles. They're about real people's lives and about the kind of society we want to create.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've explored the history, the legal complexities, and the potential for this seemingly ancient concept to manifest in surprising ways. It's a reminder that the fight for justice and due process is ongoing.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a fight that requires all of us to be informed, engaged, and willing to speak out against injustice wherever we see it. The Bill of Attainder clause might seem like a dusty old relic of the past, but it's actually a powerful tool for protecting individual rights in the face of government overreach. By understanding this concept and its history, we can be better equipped to defend ourselves and our communities against any attempts to erode those fundamental freedoms.
Well said. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, and I hope it inspires our listeners to continue exploring this topic and engaging in these crucial conversations. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of law history, and the enduring struggle for justice.